The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you are absolutely free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up doing it. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. Before I announce the interview for this week, I just want to say that we at The Final Straw would like to solicit our visual arts-oriented listeners for t-shirt designs. We do not have one yet, and it's been a long time in coming. You can send any designs you have to thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, and we will think of some good prizes and presents to give you in return. This week, I interviewed Mark Bray, who is a professor, author, and anti-authoritarian, about the G20 protests that took place in Hamburg, Germany last week. We will talk about the event, how it unfolded, much in the way of cultural and historical context for resisting G20 summits, and much more. You can follow our guests on Twitter at Mark__Bray, B-R-A-Y, and search any search engine to find his books. The beats you're listening to now are Johnny Mauser with Welcome to Hell, which was the hip-hop track used to promote resistance to G20 this year.
But first, a few announcements. The July 2017 edition of the monthly English language podcast Bad News, Angry Voices from Around the World is just out from the International Anarchist Radio Network. As of this moment, the network's website is yet to debut at a-radio-network.org. So you can check out our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and our RSS podcast feed for a link to this newest episode. We'd like to present a breaking announcement. Longtime North Carolinian organizer and anarchists Katie Yow has just released a statement that she's been subpoenaed to a federal grand jury in Greensboro and will be refusing to cooperate. We at the Final Straw Radio wish to express our care and support to Katie as she faces down this threat, with our hearts full of the knowledge that she won't be resisting this alone, but alongside all of us who know that backing down is not a choice and that we can win. Many before have resisted and will continue to the recalcitrant refusals of Team Grumbles. And here's a statement from Katie Yow.
My name is Katie Yow. On Monday, July 10th, I was served a subpoena to a federal grand jury being held in Greensboro, North Carolina, and ordered to appear on July 31st. While many things about what will happen next are developing and uncertain, one thing is absolutely clear. I will never comply with this or any subpoena. I have lived in so-called North Carolina for my entire life. I am a social worker and an artist who works in mental health and advocacy with young folks whose lives are impacted by courts and incarceration. I spent years before this as an elementary school teacher, a high school librarian, and running a bookstore and community center. I have been an anarchist for nearly half my life. My convictions as an anarchist inform every part of my life, and being part of anarchist movement gives me all the strength I need to resist this subpoena. I am resisting this grand jury with the benefit of the example of decades of committed and courageous grand jury resistance by comrades across our movements. I am resisting this grand jury with the considerable support and wisdom of many people who work every day to combat state repression. I am resisting this grand jury in solidarity with all those resisting the unforgivable daily violence of the state. While we do not yet know the subject of this grand jury, we do know that it follows a spike in FBI harassment across the state. We also know that grand juries are used to intimidate communities of resistance. Whatever the specifics of this situation, our response to this grand jury must be defiance. I want to express how moved and fortified I have been by the outpouring of support I have already received in the several days that we have been spreading the word about this subpoena. If there is anyone else who is in the same position that I am with this grand jury, I want to urge you to make it public and to resist this grand jury with me and with all of us. If you have been contacted or subpoenaed, you can email norepressionnc@protonmail.com. I cannot begin to explain what defending the land and the people I call home means to me, but I want to express that my resistance to this grand jury comes from my fierce love for them. I was raised in movement by bold and resilient elders, inheriting histories of resistance that taught me what it means to fight from where you stand. I know people here will respond to this as we do the many other challenges we face, with care, creativity, joy, humor, and resolve. Our struggle is long, and our lives are spent in commitment to it. I have spent over a decade organizing and building family with some of the bravest and kindest people I could imagine knowing, and I have known long before now the depths of our strength. It is with honor to that strength that I say that there is nothing on this earth that could compel me to degrade my integrity by testifying in a grand jury. The state demeans everything that we hold dear when they threaten us in this way. The most free and wild thing we have in this world is our love for each other, and we know that our health, our safety, and our liberation can only exist in a world without their cops, their courts, and their cages. Our strength lies in knowing that we can provide that for each other, and that nothing they offer or threaten is worth betraying our commitment to our communities. As state repression escalates, I know that all of us are struggling with the trauma and the grief that comes from the forces that we fight against, and the vulnerability that we feel to the state in its despicable efforts to attack us. What I also know, what I believe with all my heart and everything that I have, is that we have the strength we need to take care of each other and to fight back until we win.
In the Asheville area, here are a few upcoming events. On Thursday, July 20th at 7:30 p.m. at Firestorm, there will be a showing of Trouble No. 4 about movement, defense, and resisting repression, followed by Episode 2 of Channel A, a compilation of screen representations of anarchists from the popular media. This is to be laughed and cried at. This event sits in the International Week of Solidarity from July 20th to 27th with G20 defendants from the inauguration protests of D.C. this year. A solidarity statement for the week is being shared as such.
We are calling for a week of solidarity with the G20 defendants from July 20th to the 27th in 2017. This marks 6 months from the initial actions and arrests during Donald Trump's inauguration, and on July 27th, a motion to dismiss the charges will be argued in court. On January 20th, tens of thousands of people converged in Washington, D.C. for the Disrupt G20 protests to oppose the inauguration of yet another president. A combination of blockades, marches, and festive demonstrations shattered the spectacle of a peaceful transition of power. Unfortunately, with resistance comes repression. Approximately 214 arrestees now face a total of 8 felony charges apiece, including conspiracy and destruction of property. All of the G20 defendants are now facing up to 75 years in prison. The majority of defendants are working together, collectively responding to the charges and using solidarity to push back against the state. And how effectively we support the Inauguration Day defendants will determine how effectively anyone can keep resisting under the Trump administration. Turning protest into a felony offense is dangerous for anyone who believes in the right to resist. And we call on supporters to organize events and actions in solidarity with the G20 defendants throughout the week. Be creative and strategic and help cultivate a spirit of resistance and mutual aid. Visit defendj20resistance.org for more information.
On July 21st at 8 p.m. at Firestorm, a report back from protests in Hamburg, Germany will take place. From the original announcement, quote, in July 2017, the rulers of the world's 20 most powerful nations met in Hamburg, Germany, to coordinate the preservation of capitalism and state power at the expense of humanity and the natural world. Over 20,000 police were brought into the city in order to brutally suppress dissent. Yet the more violently the police attacked demonstrators, the more the general population of Hamburg came together in rebellion against them. In the end, in response to escalating attempts at repression, massive riots paralyzed the city, with some areas becoming police-free zones. We will hear a full report from Hamburg, complete with photo and video." Unquote. On July 22nd, don't forget about the barbecue, bake sale, and benefit punk show for J20 defendants here in Asheville. Details should be up on itsgoingdown.org under the title "Kettle Won't Settle North Carolina Week of Solidarity, July 20th to 27th, along with other scheduled events around North Carolina for that week. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a ball!
Let's talk about having kids. And I don't mean the Ziploc baggy and turkey-baster nonsense from previously. I mean a serious discussion. This is long overdue. I have lots of anarchist friends who are in the prime of their reproductive years, and many of them have said that they have no desire to bring children into such a messed up world. Then they rattle off any number of really terrible symptoms of modern life, from warfare and poverty to global warming and the trend toward the radical right. And they're right about all of that. Those are indications of a world in constant upheaval, one where immiseration is entirely too common. But I still disagree with their conclusion that all we face is a reason not to procreate. Consider this. Donald Trump has a whole gaggle of genetic goof-ups. So does George W. Sith Lord Dick Cheney has littered the planet with his offspring, too. In fact, everywhere you look, fascists are reproducing, and the most virulent, racist, and homophobic sociopaths are cranking out the largest number of crumb-snatching little monster brats that will grow up and continue destroying the world unless we find some way to procreate and bring the necessary assassins and hostage-takers into the world to set things right. So long as there are bankers pumping out litters of little bankers to carry on their swindle, the world is going to need an offsetting force of little bank robbers with the ideological certitude to continue such noble pursuits. Bank robbers won't grow on trees, you know, and we need them. Likewise, we need rebels to defend the natural world from the inheritors of oil wealth, rebels to challenge the next generation of warmongers and profiteers. Where are these rebels going to come from? Certainly not from the loins of Bill and Belinda Gates. Certainly not from the DNA of the Walton family atop their Walmart empire. So, when we have anarchists refraining from reproduction on the basis of their hesitancy to bring more life into this broken world, this pledge of protest, when followed through, actually makes the world even more broken. What I mean is, unless these baby boycotters intend to fix the world right now by employing some magical bean solution, so far eluding the rest of us, and then dedicate themselves to pumping out kids, the end result of their refusal to reproduce is to create a deficit of rebels in the future. Whatever their actual intent, non-reproducing anarchists are depleting the next generation of rebellion and making the future more likely worse. Our failure to procreate, for whatever reason, leaves the next generation monopolized by poor deluded hierarchs. In this way, anarchist legitimate laments about the terrible state of our world creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, guaranteeing this terrible world will get terribler and terribler. We need more rebellion, not less, more conscious militants rather than fewer. We can certainly dedicate ourselves to efforts to converting some of the already existing 7 billion humans in order to increase our numbers and increase our capacity for effective confrontation. We can do all that. But there's also the very practical approach undertaken by life on this planet for millions of years, and that's to create a great deal of genital friction that results in protein puddles. Protein puddles filled with the building blocks for new little humans. Just an observation, but you would think that anarchists would be better at creating genital friction than hierarchs, and yet we've got little to show for it. Their relative numbers continue increasing, where our relative numbers continue to dwindle. What I'm suggesting is that if we are truly troubled by the state of our world, and if we want to increase the odds of the situation improving, we need to consciously dedicate ourselves to bringing more of us into the world. And for those who protest that 2 anarchist parents are not necessarily going to have a child that will be an anarchist, I would simply say that the offspring of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman would have a slim chance of ever becoming a coal company executive. So let's rethink our approaches to reproduction. We need more tiny bundles with 10 toes and 10 fingers perfectly molded for pulling fire alarms. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from War and Corruption in Lebanon, Ohio. If you're currently creating genital friction for purposes of reproduction, then, you're not hearing a word I'm saying anyway. Never mind. Good luck.
You can write to Sean Swain at Sean Swain 243-205 Warren CI P.O. Box 120 5787 State Route 63 Lebanon, Ohio 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org. We are here speaking with, or I am here, I guess, speaking with Mark Bray about the Hamburg G20, among many other things. Would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do and maybe a little bit about your upcoming book?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me on. I love the podcast. And basically, I've been a political activist for a number of years, involved in a number of different projects and campaigns. I was involved with Occupy Wall Street in New York. I'm a member of the Black Rose Anarchist Federation and the Industrial Workers of the World. I'm also a historian. Currently, I'm teaching at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. I teach modern European history, and I wrote a book about anarchism in Occupy Wall Street called Translating Anarchy, and I've got another book coming out probably in early September called Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, which is essentially a history, politics, theory book about anti-fascism in North America and Europe. And I was in the G20. I attended the G20 protests recently, so be happy to share my experiences.
Definitely. Yeah, and maybe we should just jump right into G20 stuff. So we're here to talk about the G20 and what happened in Hamburg, like you said, recently. Would you speak a little bit about the G20 just to set the stage for listeners who maybe aren't aware? What is it, and why, in your opinion, has opposition to this particular thing attained like this level of prominence for anti-authoritarians and anti-capitalists?
Yeah, so, I mean, the G20 is a collection of more or less the 20 most powerful governments in the world, their heads of state and banks, to discuss how to rule the global economy. It's pretty insidious. And, if you want to make a critique of injustice in the world, there's no better example of sort of the whole nexus of state and capital and imperialism in one place at one time. Historically, it wasn't always the G20. Earlier on, I think in the 70s, it started out as 6 countries, basically Western European countries, the US and Japan. It expanded into the G7, I think, when Canada joined. For a while, it was the G7 plus Russia. Then it became the G8. So, for example, in 2002, I went to protest the G8 in Ottawa in Canada. It was a G8 back then, and then they expanded into the G20. So, to some small extent, you can see how there is a mild attempt to bring some of the major economies of the global south into this ruling cabal. But nevertheless, it still shows the exclusivity of global governance. And for anti-capitalists and anti-authoritarians, I believe the major protests against these whatever number you want to fill in summits, I think really corresponded with the global justice movement of the late 90s and early 2000s. So I went in 2002 in part because I sort of came of age politically in that context. I think that the sort of, in the U.S., there was, after that wave when the anti-war movement started, there was an increasing critique of what was referred to as summit hopping and putting all of our energy into these once a year, twice a year gatherings. And so, for example, I didn't go to another G8 or G20 protest. I didn't go to the one in Pittsburgh or the one in Toronto, in part because I had other stuff going on in my life, but also because of that sort of critique of summit hopping. But I think, and also I've spoken to European comrades, and it wasn't exactly the same dynamic from what I've been told in Europe. It was more of a shift from having the G20 summits in major locations to having them in remote villas where it's hard to organize a protest. And also sometimes what they've done over the past 15 years is shift from having these major G20 summits with all the heads of state to having more topic-based summits not attended by heads of state to make them sort of less of a spectacle. But I think both in the US and in Europe, there's a little bit of a bounce back towards the mobilizing potential of having these large protests around these large summits because of the opportunity to really create a very visible, very tangible opposition to what these people are doing to the world, to the environment, to millions of people around the world. So I think it's sort of, there have been some ebbs and flows in terms of the popularity of protesting these things, but certainly I would imagine that the power of this Hamburg protest will propel more similar protests in the future, to the degree that they have these summits somewhere that we can even protest them. So, yeah.
Definitely. That is super right on. You mentioned this like critique of summit hopping. Would you briefly describe that for listeners who might not be aware of that dynamic?
Right. So, the Battle of Seattle in '99, at least for a North American audience, was, a moment that really defined an era where, for the first and maybe the only time, I'm not really sure, activists managed to shut down the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. And that kind of resistance was principally defined by sort of two kind of currents. One was the Black Bloc, sort of the popular introduction to the notion of the Black Bloc for a North American audience happened when a number of anarchist anti-authoritarians carried out a campaign of targeted property destruction, not only to target companies like the Gap or Starbucks or whatever, but also to essentially increase the cost of having these kinds of summits in a city, to make cities think twice about bringing the world financial elite to their town. And then the other side being the more direct action focused people who organize blockades and direct action to shut down the meeting. So between all these different elements, the meeting was shut down. And this excited a lot of people, myself included, who then would travel sometimes great distances to protest the International Monetary Fund, to protest the World Bank, WTO, the World Economic Forum in New York in, I think it was 2002. So there was this sort of developing calendar of events that anti-capitalists would travel to. And a critique developed, which I was increasingly sympathetic to over time, that while these moments are important, after Seattle, the security state responded and made it so that it was really no longer feasible to actually shut down these meetings. And secondly, so much resources were put into arranging buses, arranging logistics, planning these actions, organizing these spokes councils for events that would last a day or two, and then what about the rest of the year? So there was a little bit of a shift away from that towards thinking about what we can do locally, what we can do in our communities, at our workplaces, and so forth. So that was pretty much what the debate was. And it's not a debate that will ever be resolved. I think there's value in doing local work. There's value in protesting large meetings. I don't think it's an either or, but it certainly is a conversation that everyone should have who's interested in these issues about where to put resources and what the kind of results and goals are of putting them into these things.
Definitely. I remember when I was coming up as like an anarchist in, the late 90s, and I remember like going to the G8 in Pittsburgh and remember like having these conversations about how it was this sort of dynamic that you just described was creating a kind of stale dynamic within, sort of resistance cultures, and what do we do about that? But it's really interesting to think about like the changing dynamic of resistance cultures right now. And I think that that's something that we're still very much trying to figure out sort of as we go along. Having been
right.
like,
And to add to that, there have recently been, as I'm sure most listeners are aware, some really important moments politically, whether you can think of Ferguson or Baltimore, in the Black liberation struggle, in Occupy Wall Street, here Hamburg's another one. So that I think should encourage us not to forget the importance of moments and what they can do for year-round organizing. So ideally that we could try to balance both.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. Would you speak about this particular G20 and sort of your impressions about how it was organized, and also a little bit about the schedule and sort of your impressions of what the overall event was like?
Yeah, of course. So the G20 summit was held in Hamburg, Germany. And for listeners who may not be aware, that's one of the historic strongholds of the German autonomous movement dating back to the 80s, and I'm sure to some extent earlier, and is really the home of a very vibrant anti-authoritarian protest culture. Even the local soccer team, or football as they call it over there, St. Pauli, is one of the most famous anti-fascist football teams in the world. And so it struck a lot of people, myself included, as strange that they would organize this summit in this heart of autonomous anti-authoritarian resistance. Some people have debated whether, on the one hand, they were simply clueless, on the other, it was some sort of elaborate ploy to create an excuse for repression on the community. I can't really say either way. I have no idea, though. My guess is probably some people who were planning this were simply just not very well informed. But when I arrived in Hamburg, it was my first time to the city, and since I'm a historian of Europe, I happened to be a few countries away doing research, and I figured I'd go to participate. And the actual convention location where they had the G20 was within easy walking distance of the main social centers that organized the protests. So Hamburg is not that big of a city. And it's not only that they just picked like a convention center that was, a half an hour drive out of the center. It was right within easy walking distance of where many of the conflicts with the police occurred. So it was a very strange location. I arrived a couple days before the main protest started, and I can give you sort of a sense of some of the main moments. So on July 5th, the day before the main protest started, they had a sort of march dance party called I'd Rather Dance Plenty Than G20. And I was a little dismayed that it was mostly techno music that they were playing. It's not my thing, but people were really enjoying it. And one thing that's different from American protests is that in Germany, at least, they have a lot of trucks with loud sound systems every so often. And so they were blasting all sorts of music, mostly techno, some hip hop. And that had really tens of thousands of people and was really massive. And it showed that I only saw one instance of a kind of pro-G20 propaganda around the city, and it was on the side of some sort of major industrial shipping company that said something about fair trade. But everywhere else around the city, there were no G20 posters and signs and banners all around people's homes. So really the whole city was very opposed to the G20 and having it there. On the next day, which was the first major day of the protests, was the Welcome to Hell March was planned. And in terms of the organizing, as far as I could tell, there were a couple of different main kind of organizing hubs for the protests. One was the kind of anarchist, anti-authoritarian, autonomous scene who organized the Welcome to Hell demonstration or march. And they were based out of a number of different social centers. The Rota Flora was one of the main ones. Unfortunately, the Welcome to Hell march didn't really end up being a march because the police attacked it before it could begin. The justification that I heard from the police was that there were people in the crowd who were wearing masks, which is true. But before the march could even start, they attacked, and there have been a lot of images going around social media of the enormous black bloc that was there, that was towards the front. And the black bloc held their own for a while, but were eventually pushed back by a massive police presence and by the very generous use of water cannons on the part of the police. And so once they decided they didn't want this event to happen, the water cannons really targeted the entire crowd, which was maybe 7,000 people. I'm not great with crowd estimates, but it seems something like that. And the police were really very brutal in beating people up. And that's another interesting difference with Europe versus the U.S. is that in the U.S., or at least, for example, in Occupy Wall Street in New York, we could have a really pretty tame march down Broadway and walk away with 100 arrests just because the police will grab people for stepping off the sidewalk or for all sorts of crazy stuff. In Europe, it's more likely that they'll just beat the crap out of you, less likely that they will arrest you. So I think in the entirety of the entire weekend of conflicts the number of arrests was something around maybe like 150 or 170, which is relatively low considering all of the conflict that was there. More often, the police would just beat the crap out of someone and leave them bleeding or unconscious on the side of the street. So it just is simply a different method because I guess they don't want to fill out the paperwork or whatever. And so the Welcome to Hell March was pretty much attacked, but that kind of triggered a decentering of the people in the march so that evening and into the subsequent evenings, there were conflicts with police and barricades set up and property destruction, as I'm sure many listeners are aware. And so the next morning, the morning of July 7th, was when affinity groups went out and set luxury cars on fire. Now, the media, of course, is prone to talk about property destruction as being completely random and without any sort of political basis and without any sort of sense of what targets are quote unquote appropriate. But if you look at what happened or photographs of the cars on fire, you'll notice several cars next to them that are not on fire. And so it really goes to show the kind of class basis by which the individuals who committed these acts were trying to target rich people. At the same time, there were blockades on the morning of the 7th around what was called the Red Zone, around the place where the convention was being held. A lot of those were organized through the Bloc G20, which I believe the interventionist left was one of the main groups putting that together, sitting in different intersections and organizing different colored blocks. So there was like a blue block of people all dressed in blue with blue umbrellas blocking an intersection. And they were sprayed pretty harshly with the water cannons. And the water cannons were often, the water in them was often laced with pepper spray. So an especially insidious way to go about doing that. And an interesting contrast, once again, from the U.S., where basically after the 60s and 70s, police stopped using water cannons because they were associated with the repression of the civil rights movement. So water cannons and dogs are pretty much done from the U.S. counter-revolutionary repertoire, at least for the time being. But in Europe, they don't have that association, so water cannons were used very liberally. And then there was also kind of a port blockade because Hamburg is a major port city. So by the morning of the 7th, it was very clear that the authorities had completely lost control over the security situation. Reports came out that Melania Trump was not allowed to attend the spouses event of the G20, the G20 spouses, because the police could not guarantee her safety. And so that is not exactly the revolution, but that is a minor victory in my book. And later in the day, there was a student march and similar kind of conflicts with the police throughout the evenings. I'm just sort of giving a general sense here, and we can talk in more detail about certain things if you want. And then the next day on the 8th, there was a massive march of maybe 100,000. I was marching near the Kurdish contingent, which was really very vibrant, well organized, had flags and banners of the Kurdish revolution, the Rojava revolution. It was very inspiring. And the sort of conflicts with the police in the Schengen neighborhood of Germany around the social centers sparked up each of these evenings. So that's sort of a general sense of what happened. And the organizers seem to be largely the anarchist, anti-authoritarian on the one hand, the kind of interventionist left, which is more of a pan left kind of formation, and then other kinds of Marxist political parties were active with clearly active in the major demonstrations. So sort of a range of left groupings.
Wow, cool. That sounds incredible. I'm curious about the kind of demographics of folks who were there without like giving too much away. Were there, mainly was it mainly German people that you saw, or like were there international folks as well? And were there like younger people, older people, that kind of?
Well, I mean, the first thing to kind of emphasize, and I think that we always need to be, have a sober take on political struggle. Some of the reports that came out talked about, Hamburg being on fire, Hamburg being in revolt. And really, that was true to the extent of certain neighborhoods, but much of the city, if you went outside of a certain area, was business as usual. So, there were a couple of neighborhoods where there is a strong protest tradition and also a strong, like a rowdy football tradition. So, for example, in the United States, at least, in my experience, with protest mobilizations, you often have your anarchist, anti-authoritarian march, which is usually the usual suspects, sometimes in black bloc, sometimes not, usually young. And then you have your sort of more mainstream demonstration, which is larger. That dynamic also played out here with the Welcome to Hell being the anarchist anti-authoritarian demo, and then a couple days later, the enormous massive demonstration. But the Welcome to Hell demo, even so, had like maybe 6,000 to 8,000 people of all sorts of ages and demographics. And I think it to some extent reflects the degree to which in the kind of football protest, as some people call it, hooligan culture, that sort of brings in large sectors of the population across all sorts of different lines. So when the intense conflicts were happening with the police in the evening around the social centers, there were people that you wouldn't normally expect at a riot, sort of like walking through more casually. A lot of the restaurants didn't really even shut down, and people were just continuing to eat their food, looking out the window as the police were shooting water cannons. And some locals told us that partly the reason is that these kinds of conflicts with the police happen after football matches or in other circumstances on a fairly regular basis. So although what happened in Hamburg with the G20 was, even by their standards, exceptional, it seemed more exceptional from the outside looking in. Now, among the people who were active in these kinds of more anarchist, anti-authoritarian moments, it seemed to be overwhelmingly European, but within Europe, very international. So people from Western Europe, from Spain, France, Italy, some Eastern Europeans, a bunch of Scandinavians. So it was a range. You can't always tell, and it's not as if I went around asking everyone where they were from, but you can get a sense that it was largely European. I met a few Latin Americans. There were some Americans there, myself included, but it was largely European, in part just because it's hard to get there. In Europe, for most of the EU countries, they have something called the Schengen Zone, where, in theory at least, it's free to drive or take a train between most of the countries as if you were going between states in the U.S. But for the G20, they put a lot of police presence on different borders, stopping trains and buses from France and from the Netherlands and searching people and trying to prevent this kind of influx of the revolutionaries of Europe. And they seem to have very minimal success in doing that. At the larger demonstrations, it was, of course, much more diverse and had more different kinds of political groupings and factions. It was just simply enormous. But that was sort of my sense. And with the conflicts with the police in the U.S., whenever people are shouting "F the police" or whatever, there's inevitably someone who comes up and say, "You shouldn't say that about the police." And in Europe and Latin America, I've never heard that conversation happen. So that's another notable difference.
That's so interesting. So people were sort of verbally protecting the police.
Oh, maybe I didn't explain myself. In Europe, when people are saying "F the police," like, people are pretty cool with it.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Versus America, where people will jump down your throat for that.
Right. It's always a debate.
For
on
sure.
the spot.
For sure. Yeah. That's so interesting, too, about the local take on resistance. When you were talking about how people were kind of eating their food and watching the water cannons go by peacefully or whatever, I was remembering, the neighborhood where Kamani Gray was shot back maybe like six or 7 years ago. And I remember the very like relatively minor resistance in comparison to G20, of course, shut down that entire neighborhood. The martial law was declared in that neighborhood or whatever. And I just compare that and contrast that to the States, and it just seems like an entirely different world. And I could, talk about that for so long. But I remember also when I was, doing a little bit of research, seeing some images related to G20 of these people who were kind of painted to look like they were stone or statues. Do you know what that was about, or if that was in any way related to G20? It seemed like it might be a kind of artistic resistance or something like that.
Right. It was like an artistic march protest. I think it was like 100 people. It was a G20 protest, and I think they were supposed to be like covering themselves in like what represented like ash, to sort of represent, I think, the kind of destruction of the world through the G20. I wasn't at that one, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but it was something along those lines. Yeah.
Cool. There's so much to kind of like talk about and sort of sink your teeth into about what you described about the resistance to the G20, but I was wondering if for you particularly, are there any anecdotes or moments from your experiences that you'd also feel okay talking about on the radio that you would reflect on as something that sums up the event for you?
Well, I guess there's two things that come to mind. The first is that while a lot of attention has been rightfully allocated to the conflicts with the police, the building of barricades, the property destruction, and so forth, what gets left out of that frequently is that this put the German police in such a state of shock that they essentially closed off much of the city surrounding the areas where they were concerned about these little revolts, that it really paralyzed the movement of the city. So I was stuck behind on the wrong side of one of these for a while, and I was walking from intersection to intersection, and there were massive police vehicles and militarized police at every intersection, preventing anyone from coming through, even people who lived on the other side of this blockade. And they shut down a lot of the subway lines and other train lines that would go into these areas. And so what it shows in part is that it's not just a question of what is happening in any given moment of resistance, but the kind of ripple effects that go out. And when we're talking about protest against a major summit like this, for example, there are sort of two ways to really strategize resisting it, in my opinion. One is trying to shut it down. And so that, as in terms of its absolute sense, is within reason, is really not that plausible anymore. You're not going to really be able to entirely shut down the G20, but there were successful intersection blockades in the mornings that delayed certain delegations, and those are victories that are important on that side. The other way to sort of think about it is to make the cost of having these summits so ridiculous, both in terms of money, in terms of resources, in terms of public outrage, in terms of effort, make these kinds of summits so difficult to hold that in the future cities won't want to hold them, and possibly they'll sort of go out of style. And I read one article in some news site saying that even prior to the Hamburg G20, there was discussions in high German political circles that, you know what, maybe these summits in general are really not worth it. Like, we could talk on the phone. We don't need to put all of this effort into these massive meetings. And so by having these revolts, by building barricades, by setting luxury cars on fire, it created a ripple effect that essentially paralyzed much of Hamburg and affected a lot of people's lives, and created, even among people who are sympathetic to the G20, a sense that, you know, boy, if the G20 comes to my town next time, it's going to make my life annoying. And so that I think shows the kind of power of the protest beyond the sort of immediate tangible. And then the second thing that kind of comes to mind is the major instances of property destruction and revolt were the ones from July 7th, from the first full day of the summit. So for July 8th, there were a lot of people who came down to the main district where this occurred the next day, clearly to see what would happen. And so the main protest on the 8th wrapped up around 3 p.m. and myself and many hundreds, thousands of people sort of flocked to this area around Rotaflora, which is the main sort of social center, main kind of headquarters for the protest. And it was sort of a surreal scene to essentially watch all these people sitting around, and as the hours passed, looking increasingly bored, waiting for what they hoped or expected would be a riot. And this is sort of a strange thing of seeing all these people that everyone knows why the other people are there, but the kind of human experience of being bored and all the kind of hours of boredom that are interspersed in between the kind of quote unquote glamorous moments. It was just kind of a surreal moment that reminded me of the kind of human experience of how these things are actually function and the times in between, and also how a lot of people really gravitate to these kinds of moments of conflict more than mainstream pundits realize, and that these kinds of moments can spark movement building, can spark broader resistance, and are not necessarily antithetical towards other forms of resistance.
That is so sort of when you were talking about the boredom and sort of people sitting around, that just so many memories came back, and it made me think about the really kind of mysterious nature of the riot and how so many kind of micro moments go into building that one huge moment that are totally illegible, in a way. And maybe those periods of boredom are really drive the riot in some way.
Yeah, and also I think just to add one other thing, if you don't mind, being there, being in any kind of context, you get a better sense of the grittiness of what makes it happen. So one thing I was very struck by is Europe in general, but Germany especially, has a really strong outdoor drinking culture. So it's not illegal, or at least it's not enforced, to kind of walk down the street drinking a beer. And so when you combine that with the kind of rowdy football culture, and also take into account that even, for example, before the Welcome to Hell event, the Welcome to Hell was supposed to be a march. It was attacked by the police. But for about 3 hours leading up to that, there was a stage with a concert with music, and people were just sort of sitting around, gradually accumulating. And many of those people had gone to the liquor store and bought 6-packs of beer and had bottles of beer and were drinking prior to this march. And that, of course, wouldn't be allowed in the U.S., and also just a different culture. But when you're in these districts where these riots break up, there are empty beer bottles just littering the streets, in large part because of this drinking culture. And so this is sort of kind of kindling, in a certain sense, for a riot, for people, some of which have had a few to drink, to be able to use these things as projectiles against the police. So it's sort of the kind of raw materials are sitting there. Not to mention, of course, the other thing, that a lot of these streets are not paved with cement, but are built with paving stones that are relatively easy to pry out of the ground. So you put all these things together, and you take into account the fact that the police are really very reluctant to arrest people. You get the kind of building blocks for a riot.
That is also, seems like an infrastructural advantage to to fomenting kind of riot. Were people generally, looking for a riot, or were there many people who were kind of just like, we're just going to march on the sidewalk? Or is that kind of a cultural norm that kind of doesn't translate over to Europe?
Well, I mean, one, it's of course hard to tell, and I'm sure some people themselves don't even necessarily know either way, but circumstances will lead them in one direction or the other. With the Welcome to Hell march, or with some of these other moments, I always wonder, from a police perspective, are they better off, if they want to maintain control, are they better off moving in and shutting it down, or simply letting it be? Because to me, it seemed like, especially the evening that I was mentioning to you about people getting bored and waiting around, people were waiting around from maybe 3 p.m. until 11:30 at night, and the numbers were starting to thin out. And I wondered what would happen if the police just simply stood back, and people would eventually, of course, just go home. And the other thing to mention with that is there were scenes of expropriating materials from different stores and breaking glass and so forth. But there were actually very few stores in that district that were at all kind of your typical targets, because most of the stores were local businesses. Many of them were immigrant businesses, and those were not touched. The stores that were attacked were basically sort of the equivalent of CVS and banks and things like that. But after the first night, those were all smashed. So by the night of the 8th, there weren't a lot of very obvious targets for that kind of behavior. And it seemed like if the police had just stayed back, maybe nothing would have happened. But after a while, they moved in with their water cannons and did their whole thing. There was a line of people sitting down in the street in front of them that were sprayed with pepper spray and water and so forth. So it's sort of always interesting to kind of keep an eye on whether they go in, whether they hold back. So in some of these contexts, there are people waiting around who don't, quote unquote, look the part. Not that you can always tell, but sometimes you can tell that people are, at least in terms of their gear, preparing for some sort of a conflict. But when the police moved in, there's sort of this antagonistic culture towards the police in some of these neighborhoods, where all sorts of people from all walks of life will throw a beer bottle or shout at them or stand in front of the police. And so I think that in a lot of these contexts, there's sort of all sorts of gradients and spectrums of what people will do in certain circumstances. And of course, when they beat people up, this enrages a lot of people and makes them more sympathetic to it. So it's hard to fully tell, but I think that the kind of black and white between quote unquote violent and nonviolent protests that we have in the US is a little murkier in Europe. That's my impression.
That's really interesting. I have this question, and I was thinking about how to phrase it, and I realized that it's kind of a huge one that might have a lot of holes in it because of cultural differences and the different degrees of pervasiveness of the state and so on. But I was wondering about what you thought about what this particular resistance will mean for similar mass mobilizations kind of moving forward.
Yeah, well, in terms of the G20 specifically, I was curious where it's going to be over the next couple of years, so I looked that up. And the next one is going to be in Argentina. So certainly that should be a pretty rowdy protest mobilization among people from different Latin American countries and elsewhere. After that's in Tokyo, I think, and then after that is in Saudi Arabia, and you can't really protest in Saudi Arabia. So in part, I think it'll have to do with where they are. But in terms of protest mobilizations more broadly, I spoke to a comrade of mine who's part of the interventionist left in Germany, and he was explaining that there are kind of debates within their group over whether to focus on local organizing or to put time into large mobilizations. And they have working groups that sort of do different things. And one of their working groups organized what they called Blockupy in Frankfurt, which was a big sort of protest mobilization. And some of those folks, I believe, were involved in the Block G20 street blockades during the G20. So there is a little bit of a kind of lead up in developing a large scale protest kind of routine in Europe. But I'm not, you need sort of a bit of a reason to have these kind of transnational protests. They don't just kind of come up on their own. And as much as we strive to be internationalists, most of the reasons to protest in most countries are national. And so the G20 kind of gives people an excuse to come together. And if the world leaders smarten up a little bit and just simply stop having these public events, it might shift how these things are done. So that encourages us, I think, to not only think about organizing transnationally around big summits or big events, but around different issues, whether it be around refugee solidarity, anti-fascism, union organizing, or what have you. So it's hard to say. We'll see what happens from here.
Definitely. And I could, speculate endlessly about the thing that you said in the very beginning about why Hamburg, with such a, vibrant anti-fascist current within the city and all these things. But I was wondering about also, like, regarding the organizing of the event, were there things that worked super well or particularly didn't work at all, so that like folks can, in your opinion, so that folks can, think about organizing these things in the future?
Yeah, well, some of what happened was organized in a quasi-public way. Some of it was organized in a much less public way, and I can't really comment on the motivations or methods of the people who were more clandestine about their actions, but we can talk a little bit about the results, which show that, I took a look at some of the local newspapers in Germany, and many of them had like an image of Merkel and Putin and Trump on the one side and like flaming cars on the other side. And that kind of visual is really powerful. And I think it shows how some people are willing to potentially risk their liberty and well-being to strike back against the international capitalist elite and make a point that what these people are doing is really destroying lives and destroying the planet. And so, in that sense, in terms of raising the cost of having these kinds of events, it's clear that property destruction can be useful if people choose to go in that direction. In terms of the kind of blocking the summit, the morning blockades at different intersections were fairly effective insofar as you can hold up to a police cannon. And the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is thinking about direct action in relation to public discourse and public opinion, because the on the one hand, the images of people getting sprayed with these water cannons as they're wearing blue and sitting in an intersection are very helpful to really elicit the kind of constantly underlying brutality of the state and show people the true nature of the police. And on the other hand, this property destruction and black bloc tactics and so forth are also very useful in terms of really undermining the notion that the police can maintain full control at all times, and also in showing the lengths that people will go to really fight back against this terrible system. I was curious with the Welcome to Hell March that the police shut it down on the excuse that people were wearing masks. And I was surprised because many fewer people in the black bloc were wearing masks than I expected. A lot were wearing black sunglasses, black baseball caps, black jackets. But I think that there's a rule in Germany that among your mouth, nose, and eyes, you can only cover one of the three at any given time legally. So I think that's my guess is why some people did the sunglasses instead. Other people masked up fully. And I'm wondering if the organizers anticipated being attacked by the police for wearing masks or not. Maybe they thought they'd have more leeway, that they'd be able to get halfway through the march or what have you. But certainly I imagine that's something for organizers to consider in the future is what the police will or will not allow in terms of masks. The main thing, though, that I was very impressed with is the logistics of organizing the protests. So the network of social centers that they have in Hamburg year-round is astounding. They have places all around the city, and these places offered people food and clothing and places to sleep. And the kind of logistical organizing and infrastructure was the best I've seen for any protest mobilization anywhere. And I had a friend who arrived on a train from another country, and when he got off the train, there was someone waiting there asking if he needed a place to stay. And the informational literature they were handing out was top-notch, very clear. And so if we're thinking about how to get people involved, get the information out, and to get people excited among people who aren't already committed, that kind of infrastructure and information is super important. The legal team seemed to be really on top of it. They had first aid teams. They also had emotional first aid that people who were traumatized by something that happened could go and have someone to talk to. And I think that's the first time I've seen that. And that's, I think, a really great idea. So I guess my takeaways are logistics and are the ways that different forms of direct action can kind of leverage public opinion to make people sympathetic on the one hand, and on the other hand, reluctant to want to have something like the G20 come to their town.
Definitely. Yeah, and the infrastructure is so important because people want to come, but they also need to like have their needs met. Also, the anti-masking law thing is really interesting because I know here in Asheville, we have anti-masking laws that are ostensibly kind of on the books. They're anti-KKK laws, but they're often used against like people who are masked up in black bloc and all these things. It's interesting how those things play out.
Right, and that's reminiscent of the kind of anti-fascist argument that you don't turn to the state to shut down the far right because whatever they come up with is going to be used against you.
Yeah, definitely. Are you aware of any support regarding the arrestees or any like medical bills support that people are asking for, like directly relating to the G20?
Yeah, for people that want to help, there's a group called Rote Hilfe, and that's spelled ROTE space HILFE, Rote Hilfe, which I think means red aid or something like that. And they're the kind of legal support infrastructure. So if you Google that, I think that they have links to donate and information on the people who are still incarcerated. I think it was somewhere around 150 people who were arrested in total. I think that maybe half of those people are out, maybe half are still in. I don't know the exact details, but that would be your first step in trying to figure out how to support.
Word. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling people how they can find your books or follow you on social media or such things like that. Yeah.
So I tweet on Twitter. I'm at Mark, M-A-R-K __ BRAY, 2 underscores because with one it was already taken. And my Anarchism and Occupy Wall Street book, Translating Anarchy, you can just Google and it's available on various sites to pick up. And the Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, is coming out late August or early September. You can pre-order it now. Once again, if you just Google Mark Bray Antifa, and it should pop up. And I'll be doing book presentations around the country. So come out and say hello if I'm in your town.
Excellent. Mark Bray, thank you so much for coming onto The Final Straw and talking about this event and your words and all the history. It was super interesting for me to get to talk with you about this. That was our interview with Mark Bray about the Hamburg G20. Again, you can follow him on Twitter at Mark__Bray and search the net for his books. If you are in Asheville, you can see an in-person report back about the G20 at Firestorm Books and Coffee, 610 Haywood Road on this Friday, July 21st at 8 p.m.
Revolution destroyed all the enemy army. After a hard fight, and when we took the power, which were our sisters?
You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you are absolutely free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up doing it. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. The track you're listening to right now is just simply called Antifa Hip Hop, and it was uploaded to YouTube by a group called Socialist LBN.
Alle Feinde des Systems, komm schon, hebt die Hand. Beide Faust, streck sie raus und geh gegen an. Viva la Revolution, die Zeit ist reif. Hayez und SMD, Guerilla 2003. Alle Feinde des Systems, komm schon, hebt die Hand. Beide Faust, streck sie raus und geh gegen an. Viva la Revolution, die Zeit ist reif. Hayez und SMD, Guerilla 2003. Projektile fliegen zielgerichtet gegen den Finanzmarkt, der Quadrat. In die Jones, als des kleinen Mannes Anwalt. Vertreten wir das Volk gegen staatliche Übermacht, die drüber lacht und über Nacht das ganze Viertel überwacht. Meinung macht mit Werbespots, dass jedes Mädchen gerne kotzt und keiner merkt, weil ihr zu blind seid und nur in die Ferne glotzt. Sie catchen dich, nehmen dich auf mit Kameras der Überwachungsstadt 2003. Schützt das Kapital auf radikale Art und Weise, arm und reich. Ich zeige die dunkle Seite der freien Welt, wenn ich reime, und dies sind keine